Yeah, thanks, Kazi. And yeah, I just want to welcome Claudia Tebaldi to give our seminar today. Claudia works as a scientist for the Joint Global Climate Research Institute. I always get that mixed up, which is housed in the same building as ESSEC. And she's has a joint appointment with ESSEC, and actually we've started doing some work together. We'd like to enhance that going forward, but she's going to talk. Has done a lot of work with climate modeling and extremes. So I guess you started your career, you're a statistical climatologist, I believe, or just a statistician, and gotten into the modeling, and her work's highly recognized in the field, and she participates in the annual IPCC assessment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Claudia, and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to share my presentation. Let me know if it looks okay to you.
That looks great.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Let me move around now this little bar so that I see what I want to talk about. Okay, so again, thank you for being here. Today, I want to talk to you about the proposal that we are submitting very soon for the new scenarios that are going to guide the modeling of future projections by Earth system models that participate in the next phase of CMIP, which is going to be CMIP 7. So CMIP stands for Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. It's a project of the World Climate Research Program, and as many of you know, the results of these kind of experiments are widely used and are also key to structure and inform large parts of the IPCC assessment reports. So every phase of CMIP has had scenarios, and for the last two phases, a particular model intercomparison project, a particular MIP, has been in charge of proposing what kind of trajectories of future emissions we are going to feed into climate models to derive projections. That MIP is called ScenarioMIP. I'm one of 3 co-chairs. You see the other 2 listed here. We have also 20-something steering committee, a scientific steering committee that has worked on this proposal. And so let me go ahead and start. If I can move my slides. So just a very quick refresher of how scenarios looked last time around for CMIP 6. So these were the scenarios that were produced under our last proposal. I show you here just very simple global temperature trajectories. The colored lines here represent 5 of a few more scenarios that we propose to run, but definitely 4 of these were the priorities, the ones that are, 2.6 and above in terms of radiative forcing at 2100. But we also had a scenario that was developed kind of late in the process after the Paris Agreement. And that scenario was supposed to remain likely with 50% probability and around 1.5 degrees. And that's what happened. And so you'll see it there as well. Just one thing I want to mention for those of you that may be familiar with the concept of shared socio-economic pathways. When you run an integrated assessment model to produce these emission pathways, you have to have a narrative and some quantitative guidance for the model to produce a coherent scenario of emissions. That guidance was given and is given again by these shared socioeconomic pathways that represent alternative pathways of development for the world in terms of, things like GDP, population, technology, progress. So the matrix that you see here, this square diagram that may seem very confusing, was a way in the paper that described this protocol to show that different pathways of socio-economic development, here indicated along the column by SSP 1 through 5, that have different narratives, different assumptions about how fast, how well things develop, can be used to develop similar radiative forcing scenarios, similar outcomes in terms of emissions, because for a given shared socioeconomic pathway, you can just run it through your IAM, derive the emissions that are so-called a baseline for this socioeconomic pathway, but then you can also rerun the same pathway with mitigation options, and therefore reach radiative forcings that are lower. Now, our maybe misguided choice was to name the old scenarios SSP something something, giving the impression that only, for example, SSP2 could get you to 4.5 watts per meter square at the end of the century. Only SSP3 could get you to 7.0, while for at least some of the intermediate outcome, you can use more than an SSP to derive a very similar emission pathway. And this will become relevant when I tell you about the new protocol. Okay, so a couple of other things about the last phase is that we asked climate models to take this pathway as concentrations, trajectories to use as external forcings. So all the experiments under ScenarioMIP last time around were concentration-driven experiments. And I have here a couple of references. Brian O'Neill led the paper that described the protocol that was published in 2016. It has more than 3,000 citations currently, just to demonstrate how widely these scenarios are considered. I'm sure some of these citations are against them, but the major portion of those citations is because people use these scenarios for all sorts of applications. And this figure comes from the IPCC report, but we have also a paper that I led where we present some of the very broad picture results from the climate model experiments run under these scenarios. Okay, so this was last time around, and now CMIP 7 has started, and we were asked to think about a new set of scenarios for the new phase of climate model projections. So I want to start a little bit, upstream by telling you how we think about our purpose, because even if we should always remember that our main goal is to provide these external forcings for climate modeling centers to run their models. So this is a project that is within the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. It's first and foremost a project that provides forcings for Earth system model experiments. We are aware, of course, that these type of experiments, this type of simulations are used for very, very diverse type of uses. Of course, the first and foremost that comes to mind is the fact that we take what comes out of these experiments to look at what happens at the physical climate. So we have, climate scientists, physical climate scientists that look at what this type of anthropogenic emission pathways are doing to the physical climate. But then there is a large, wide community of other type of research, for example, impact research, mitigation research that uses the same kind of experiments to determine what are the consequences of those physical climate changes, or how we could think about a trade-off between mitigation cost and impact or benefits of mitigation. And then, of course, the same kind of results from climate models can be used for practical applications. For example, could be used by practitioners to inform decisions, on the ground, let's say. But we also need to recognize that, as I said, these experiments, the results of these experiments are, at the end of the day, structuring and constituting a very large portion of, for sure, the Working Group 1 IPCC report, but also they often serve as, a thread that unifies the other two working groups. And for those of you that are not familiar, the Working Group 1 looks at the physical science of climate change. Working Group 2 looks at impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and Working Group 3 looks at mitigation. And so we need to recognize and be cognizant of the fact that these scenarios are policy relevant. So we cannot just develop scenarios that don't have anything to do with the discussion out there, for example, about targets like the 1.5 or 2 degrees C targets. One thing that I need to underline is that ScenarioMIP, by construction, by decision, explicit decision, chooses to run plausible scenarios. So we are not running counterfactual scenarios. We are not running idealized scenarios. We are not running stress test scenarios just for the sake of it. We want to come up with scenarios that are plausible. And if this was an interactive conversation, I'm sure somebody would immediately ask me, what do you mean by plausible? And so when I say plausible, I mean that the scenario has to have a non-negligible likelihood to occur. And in the scenario development community, this has to be evaluated along 5 dimensions. It has to be feasible from the geophysical sense. So for example, if the scenario implies a lot of afforestation, we don't want to have a scenario that assumes that we can put forest everywhere in the world. It has to be technologically plausible. So if we assume that a lot of our mitigation is going to come from technological developments in the future, we need to have very explicit and founded defense of those assumptions. We cannot imagine that within 10 years we will be able to capture all the CO2 in the atmosphere for some magical or extraordinary breakthrough in technology. They have to be economically plausible. Mitigation has costs, and so we need to be aware of that. And also, they have to be socio-cultural and institutionally plausible. And of course, this becomes possibly a little bit of a fuzzy realm to talk about, but I'm sure everybody can think of counter cases where a scenario could assume some really absurd change in behavior, or some really unrealistic institutional tools by which things get implemented. That's not the case for the scenarios in ScenarioMIP. Now, the process has started more than a year ago for the development of these scenarios. We had a workshop from which we derived, a first sketch of what we thought the scenarios could be. We wrote a report, we gave a webinar, and we elicited, feedback from the community. We expanded the science steering committee to be more inclusive, more diverse. We created even a larger advisory group, always for the concern of not having this being a project behind closed door that just a small group of people would dream up. And we created working groups or task forces to look into specific aspects of the design that I'm going to talk about shortly. We developed a first serious draft of the proposal that went through several iterations of reviews by first the advisory group and then a public review. And now, as we speak, we are about to submit the paper to an open review journal, GMD again. So anybody, in theory, can go read and leave comments besides, the designated reviewers. All of these because it is it would be difficult to deny that, especially after the Paris Agreement, the design of scenarios have become a very sensitive process, and there are many interests and many positions out there that would not accept, I think, a set of scenarios that hadn't gone through this kind of open review process. So let's talk about what this new design implies. We are going to propose 6 scenarios. They are going to span a wide range of radiative forcing as before. If you remember, my plot went from a scenario that was as low as 1.9 watts per meter squared at the end of the century, that ensured that the temperature was with 50% probability, given the kind of uncertainties that we can quantify, around 1.5 degrees C. And then it went all the way up to 8.5 watts per meter squared. I'll talk in a moment about what the new range is expected to be. Like before, the scenarios are going to be produced by integrated assessment models, so that the portfolio of emissions that make up a scenario is developed in along a coherent storyline, and also coherently among the various species that form, the total forcing for the climate model. And they will cover the period between 2025 and 2100. We will also have extensions from 2100 out to 2500 if climate models want to run that long, and we hope some will do, because these emissions are very relevant for studying slow processes or possible, tipping points, hysteresis effects. And in this case, as you can imagine, we don't have shared socioeconomic pathways that talk about how society is going to evolve beyond 2100. So these will be pathways that are somewhat stylized. And we will ask modeling centers, even if they don't want to run these extensions that long, to at least use them for the first 50 years, so that the standard file of a scenario that is produced by a climate model will cover the period up to 2150, recognizing the fact that we keep on, advancing the starting date, and our future scenario simulations become shorter and shorter. And differently from last time around, we won't, or at least we will suggest, we will encourage climate models to run in an emission-driven mode. And this was because of the recognition that if you have looked at the various phases of CMIP in the last, let's say, couple of phases, at least when it comes to these scenario simulations, very little changed, and very little was at least, a first order scientifically novel result. Meanwhile, models keep on evolving. Many of them are ready now to be run with active carbon cycle. This will give us a better sense of the real uncertainties of these scenarios by involving the uncertainties of the carbon cycle and of the feedbacks between climate and carbon cycle. So this is what we encourage ESMs to do, but recognizing the fact that not all ESMs or climate modeling centers are ready for this, we will also provide the same scenarios as concentration so that models can run in concentration mode like before. Okay, so now for some actual picture of the new scenarios. And I should underline here what I'm showing you here are illustrative pictures, illustrative lines. The point of the proposal is to talk about the new scenarios in a qualitative way with enough information so that the integrated assessment modeling centers can go off and develop these scenarios for real, not just by, these are almost lines that we drew on this graph. The real scenarios will be produced by integrated assessment models from now up until next year around this time or during the summer. But these are plots that will give you a sense of what we expect this scenario to be. Here are the 6 scenarios that I'm going to talk about. You see, this is in terms of CO2 emissions per year. You see the observed trajectory up until 2022, 2023 here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is where the scenarios will start around 2025. And you see that, you have a wide range of behaviors in terms of CO2 emissions, and I'm going to go into the details very soon. But then we can also show some results obtained by simple climate models like MAGIC, FAIR, HECTOR, where these emissions are translated into global temperature outcomes, just to get a sense of what we expect these scenarios to translate into. And here is that picture. So we have what we call a high scenario, a couple of medium scenarios, and 3 low scenarios. I'm going again to talk to you about this grouping in a moment. But this is what is expected in terms of warming. And I call your attention to the fact that 2100 is actually a little bit left of the limit of this plot. So you see that the high scenario, the median is expected to be around 3.5. This already suggests to you that we don't expect the high scenario to be as high as RCP 8.5. And then we also have 3 scenarios that are very close to one another, at least in terms of what we expect the noise of internal variability to produce from ESMs. But they are 3 scenarios that are designed to address the Paris Agreement targets. So we have 2 scenarios that get very close to 1.5, but they do so in different ways. And then there is a scenario that is more along the target of 2 degrees. Okay, so now I'm going to go through these scenarios fairly quickly because I see that I'm already touching the half hour. But we focus first on what we think will be the high scenario. Some of you will be aware of the criticisms of SSP 5.8.5 or RCP 8.5 in general, that was criticized as being a very unlikely scenario by now. We still don't know by consultation and by just, guesswork, I guess, that to provide a scenario with a high degree of warming is very important to many communities. For example, the impact research community is very keen to have a scenario that is as high as plausible. Even the physical climate community, if they want to use a plausible scenario to look at what high warming may mean, they want this to be pushed to the limit, again, that is plausible. Now, as you can see from this emission plot, current emissions are already much flatter than what this scenario is implying. So we have asked integrated assessment models to think of future developments that could justify a reversal of trends, really, or at least spiking of trends, where possibly policies are withdrawn, or population grows more than expected. There could be development in the world that put us back on a trajectory that now seems extremes. But we don't expect this trajectory to go as high as SSP 8.5. The one thing that we thought about was, what about aerosols emissions along this trajectory? As you know, there is often a strong correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutant emissions, like aerosols in particular. We though thought that by constructing a scenario that has a lot of aerosols, we kind of negate the purpose of these scenarios to be as high as possible in terms of warming. And so we are going to appeal to the idea that in a society that develops very strongly, produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions because that development is fueled by fossil fuels, there may be, however, attention to air quality, and therefore we can hypothesize that aerosols emissions, for example, along these scenarios are not as high as they could be. Medium scenarios, as you can see here, are the yellow ones, and they immediately tell you that the medium scenarios are conceived as what happens if we freeze current policy, and we either continue along that path until the end of the century, or after a while, say around 2040, we realize that we are creating too much havoc, and we follow a course of delayed mitigation. These scenarios were conceived, the first one, just because it's a very common question that people ask, what happens if we keep on going with exactly is in place right now? When we looked at that scenario through simple climate modeling tools, we realized, though, that by using only this scenario, there would be a large gap between these scenarios and the low ones. So we came up with the idea of a delayed mitigation scenario to kind of fill the gap between these high scenarios and the low ones. And now for the low scenarios, as I told you, these are the ones that are supposed to inform still the debate and the policy around the Paris Agreement. And we will have two scenarios that aim at reaching by the end of the century 1.5. Of course, I should underline that by requesting models to use these pathways in emission-driven mode, there will be a large uncertainty, right, in the actual outcomes of these scenarios in terms of warming. But the idea is to try and construct an emission pathway that aims, in the case of the light blue trajectory, to stay as low as plausible. And what that means, it's all to be seen. The integrated assessment models will tell us. We think by now there will be an overshoot of 1.5. It would be really, really hard not to. But it will be an overshoot that will be as low as possible, while the other trajectory will be more of a scenario that doesn't try to stay as low as possible. So a scenario that may accommodate a higher overshoot in terms of temperature, but still by the end of the century will come down through a larger use of negative emission carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal. And the third scenario, as I said, is a scenario that somewhat abandons the idea of 1.5 and aims at 2-degree world by the end of the century. Now you notice all these dashed lines are those idealized extension that we will ask the models to run for the additional 50 years beyond 2100, but these are more stylized pathways that I'm going to mention briefly in a moment. So as I mentioned, one of the critical aspects that will make this kind of experiment different from last time around is that we are asking models to run in emission-driven mode. And therefore, there will be possibly a larger uncertainty on the actual warming outcomes of these scenarios. But we think it would be more, how do you say, representative of the actual uncertainty in our modeling tools when it comes to future scenarios. The historical period will be updated. It was 2015 or 2014 in CMIP 6. It will be now up to 2023 in terms of observed forcing. And then there will be a couple of years of harmonization, and in those years it will be more of a mix between observation and extrapolation of those observations. The scenarios will start in earnest at 2025, but I'll show you the timeline in a moment. We think the climate model outcomes won't be available until 2027, 2028. So we don't want to be in the position where we have scenarios that by those days are already implausible or impossible. So the idea is that up to 2030, the scenarios will be very carefully constrained and designed not to make big changes from the observed. Now, I talked to you about these three scenarios at the low end. You have seen in that graph that they differ by fraction of a degree. And one may ask, will we even be able to distinguish these scenarios from one another once we run them through an emission-driven model? And we haven't really made a strong recommendation in terms of ensemble members. Of course, it would be great if Climate Modeling Center could afford to run many ensembles of initial condition, especially for the low end, but in general for these scenarios. But we are also aware of the competing demands and also the concern for the carbon footprint. So we recommend at least 5 ensemble members. We hope the climate models can run more, but we cannot do more than that. And just briefly, a complicated picture. Maybe we can focus only on the last panel here. These are those extensions that we are going to propose or to provide for models that want to, for example, look at the effects of warming on ice sheets and sea level rise, or possibly looking for tipping points. So there will be actually an extension that maintains this very high level of warming up until 2500. And then there will be extensions that, for example, flatten the temperature outcome around 1.5 to see what this Paris Agreement target will mean for a stabilized climate at that level. And then there will be extensions that look at very, very dramatic overshoots, again, to look at reversibility. So these are all experiments that are supposed to, test the system and look at processes that may behave very differently in a stabilization regime. I point out that we even have an extension that by using a lot of negative emissions, not only goes down from 1.5, but goes all the way down to pre-industrial. So this is what people call climate restoration. So we will, if models run this, we will be able to understand what that means for our climate, if it's even possible to get down there. Again, I probably sound like a broken record, but we will be using models in emission-driven modes. So the assumption is that we will be able to realize this level of negative emissions, but it's all to be seen if the carbon cycle will allow us to do that, or how the climate will respond to this type of forcing reversal. So I mentioned SSPs. I mentioned that we even had them in the name last time around. This time around, we have decided to downplay their role, not because IAMs won't use them, but because we don't want to perpetrate this idea that a specific SSP is really key to reach a specific forcing pathway. The SSP themselves will be updated, will be carried forward, with observed data like GDP or population until, several years after the 2015 date. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that, as I said, ScenarioMIP thinks of itself as a project relevant not only for the physical climate community, but for the adaptation, impacts of adaptation vulnerability modeling community. That's the community that looks at risk of climate change and wants to involve, projections of exposure and vulnerability. ScenarioMIP will provide not only the forcings to climate models, but also the consistent human forcing that can be used by this community, like gridded population, GDP, masks of land use, information about use of fertilizer or irrigation that are consistent with the various scenarios. And maybe the last big topic that is important to address here is the topic of equity. So equity in our case has at least two sides. First of all, I mentioned that we tried to make the process much more open this time around. So in terms of our process, we had expanded the scientific steering committee to include a wider geographic diversity and diversity of point of views. We have this large advisory group that, again, we hope represent a lot of different views in terms of scenarios. And we have been, engaging in multiple rounds of public review, which will continue to happen until the publication of this paper. But equity also is a concept that is very relevant for the scenarios themselves. And we could talk, I'm sure people give a seminar only about equity in scenarios, but for this audience and this occasion, I just want to say that, when we think about a mitigation target, there are many ways to reach that mitigation target in terms of distributing that burden of mitigation, both across the world and across time. Now, this would mean, different decisions in terms of who plants for forests or who, is allowed to use fossil fuels a little longer than other countries, and this type of decisions that then reflect on sources of emissions around the world, both in time and in space. So it's fair to, I think, assert that for climate model outcomes to a first order, and I underline in a multimodal context, what matters are global emissions of well-mixed greenhouse gases and the global characteristics of land use in terms of how much forest or not do we have. In terms of regional emissions or regional land use, which are where these concerns about equity really come up, I have a slide later, but I think I can assert that, again, in a multimodal context, it's very hard to find robust climate signals from these regional, in some cases, short-lived emission. When it comes to who emits greenhouse gases for longer or shorter, those are well mixed. So where they come from doesn't really matter, again, in a multimodal context. So from our point of view, recognizing the importance of this type of research and decisions, our scenarios won't address equity explicitly. We will have a particular scenario for a particular mitigation target, and then we encourage other communities to look at alternative scenarios. So there will be a whole community of integrated assessment modelers that for the same mitigation target will run all sorts of different mitigation distribution scenarios. And that kind of research will be very important, but wouldn't really change, again, in a multimodal context, the outcome of ScenarioMIP. At least that's what we expect. And of course, more research is welcome, but that's how we, reconcile with the idea that as ScenarioMIP, we cannot ask models to run 10 different scenarios for the same level of mitigation. Okay, and I had this slide just to just really to point you at this if you're interested. We had a paper a year or so ago where we looked at the effects of land use change differences for a scenario that had the same total level of radiative forcing, but just had different land use distributions. And we found that in a multimodal context, again, by looking at these 6 models, even if you focus on regions that show the largest coherence across models in terms of land use, we cannot find responses, for example, for extremes in this case, that are robust and consistent across all the models. And I don't have time to go into this, but I just to make the point that at least this paper shows you something about the lack of consistent signal for land use change. That's not to say that land use is not important. I'm just saying that when you compare the response of different models, you don't find a very clear outcome. And now, I think this is my last slide, just to give you a sense of all that I'm talking about, what should we expect? So we are now here at the end of 2024. Actually, integrated assessment models have already taken a draft of our proposal and started trying to develop these scenarios. And they will continue to do so as we submit the paper, which I'm hoping it will be even before the end of this month. And up until the summer of 2025, where if all goes well, climate model runs could actually start. That's a very optimistic timeline, but we hope at least for some of the scenarios that this will be true and some of the climate models. the climate models could be available, could make available their output as early as the beginning of 2027, where research could start on the basis of this output. And this accelerated timeline is really because we expect sometime in 2028, the IPCC reports would be published. And so if we want these results to inform, at least in part, some of those reports, we need this kind of accelerated timeline. So yeah, I think this is what I wanted to tell you. And of course, I welcome any reaction, any question. Happy to elaborate, or as I said, if you're interested, you can look for the paper very soon in GMD, and it will be available as a discussion paper as soon as we meet the requirement of the submission. So you can start commenting on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So now is our Q&A. So if you have a question, please, you can go ahead and raise your hand, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. If you don't have a microphone, you can just type your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud.
Did I get out of sharing my presentation, or?
Yeah, we no longer see your presentation.
Okay, I'll share it again if somebody wants to see something from it. Or maybe I'll do that. It was not what I wanted to do anyway. Okay. I've been either very confusing or very clear. I don't know.
Go ahead, Paige.
Wow, that took me a long time to figure out. I guess I don't know Zoom very well.
I was wondering if you had changed
Over
your
a minute to raise
mind.
my hand. I was just wondering, that chart that showed all the different temperature outcomes as a function of different land use change pathways, what is the primary mechanism? Is that albedo or something else, or like water use? Like what is driving those different responses, like at a mechanistic level, if you know?
Yeah, I think the expectation is that albedo mostly would create a difference in the climate, in the surface climate, you know.
Okay.
But yeah, and yeah, it would be a little complicated to explain this figure, but the message is really, if those bars represent response to you know, change in land use by the different models for the different regions. So focusing on a single region, if the bars are going in different directions, it means that the response is not consistent. And there is a subtlety there because some of the bars are actually black, meaning that they show a significant change, and some don't. So even yeah, those that seem to go in the same direction, some of them are not significant. Yeah. But as I said, you know, if you take a single model and you study very, you know, closely, then you can see all sorts of interesting things, because we know that land use change actually affects the climate, right? So I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that when you then start comparing what this type of simulations, once you prescribe them to different climate models, actually yeah, result in, you don't get a strong signal, and most of it is driven by well-mixed greenhouse gases.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Dr. Lee, did you have a question? I see that you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I have a more general question. So thanks for a nice talk. You know, emission is so much relevant to depending on the policy. Given the policy administration change in the US alone, there's such a contrast policy will be implemented when the Trump take office. So do you guys have any assessment of the changes in the new policy to the emissions. This may also apply to other countries, which may follow.
Yeah. So for us, we don't, at this stage, we are not getting into the details of what happens to this country or not. But as I mentioned, we have these high scenarios where trends of emissions somehow get reversed, or at least they change for the worse. And it's not hard to imagine why that is not an implausible scenario. So now integrated assessment models are going to use the kind of information that you're mentioning to inform the way they may or may not, simulate such a scenario. But at this stage of our proposal, we are not really getting into the details, and there are things that are more quantifiable than others, and so there are observed trends that can be used to inform what is plausible or not. There are commitments that are taken by countries that you may assume they are going to be realized or not. And there are things like incentives that you may use in your model according to how they have been deployed so far to inform how your model is going to facilitate the adoption, for example, of renewable or not. So all that happens in the world somehow is used as information at a certain level, not literally necessarily, to inform how these models are actually projecting ahead, how different technologies, different policies are going to act on the ground.
Yeah, but if a scientist have any role in the politics, this will be a time for us to really, take action to just assess what's the kind of policy he's proposing impact on our, climate.
Oh,
If we have a quick study,
yes.
I think this is more than anything else, more urgent than anything else we can think of as a
And
scientist
I'm
committee.
sure there will be many studies like that. I was part of a study during the first Trump administration that looked at what his deciding to withdraw from the Paris Agreement would mean in terms of changes in global temperature outcomes. So I'm sure there will be many studies like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Claudia while we still have her? We got a couple more minutes. And if you're also not a Zoom user, you can just let me know in the chat and I'll cue you. No pressure to try to figure out the system.
Well, we may end 4 minutes earlier.
Yeah, well, that would be all right. So unless someone interrupts me now, I am assuming that we are finished with our Q&A. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. And thank you, Claudia, for giving us this great talk. This was a long time running, so I'm so excited that you were able to come. This was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Our seminar series will continue one more week, and then we'll break for this for the holiday break. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.